Hi, I'm Sarami, and today I'm going to show you how to sew binding to a neckline when the binding finishes to one side of the neckline or the other, meaning the inside or the outside, and it doesn't straddle the inside and the outside simultaneously. Because I find that's the hardest way to finish a neckline is with binding, and I actually hesitated to make this video because I don't pull it off every time either, and I like to sew binding, and I sew a lot of it, and if you know me at all, I can handle binding. It's not too hard. I've put in a lot of time with it. So to do it on the neckline, I think that you need two key things. You need to make sure the seam allowance on the neckline is down to 1/4 of an inch and make your binding 1 inch wide. I think that's the easiest way to do it. So narrower is better, in other words. So I'm going to be using the 100 Acts of Sewing tunic number 1 pattern. This is where I struggled with it live on camera, and you can see this whole sew through back in the Sew So Live playlists for, I think, tops. And you'll see how I handled it because I actually couldn't get it to lay flat, so I just decided to kind of go with it and use the binding to its advantage and how it wanted to lay down, and it was a nice little edging of color, so it turned out okay. But I have had to do it since then, and it's a great seam finish on hems and armholes, necklines, and all kinds of other places, but it's so much easier to sew it if it's straddling the inside and the outside of the garment, meaning it's clean finish and folded on both sides like this, and it's kind of straddling it, right? So today we're going to do it so to where it's only finishing, all the binding is going to end up on the inside of the garment, and it'll be clean finished. I'm just showing you that it'll be all on the inside of the garment. So here's just the top part of the tunic number 1 neckline. And this pattern's kind of unique. It's not typical that you would see a front and a back both cut for the same pattern piece, nor would you see the back so scooped. So this is actually probably one of the harder necklines to attach binding to. But the garment makes it less fussy to use and handle, and it's probably less ironing. It is a nice finish in the way it looks and the way that the garment handles over time, but it is super fiddly to attach, and I struggle with it too. So this is my tutorial on how I like to handle it. So if you ever see me bind, you're going to remember that I usually tug binding as I go, and you do not do that on this, and I'll explain why. So, all right, we're going to start on the outside, and I just fold back the end of my binding. Remember, my binding here is 1 inch wide, and I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Very important. Don't skip those two things. All right, so I'm not going to line it up with the shoulder seam. I'm just going to go a little bit past. I like doing the start and stop for most neckline finishes at the shoulder, since the back and the front are front and center, and you see those a little easier. All right, so we're just going to sew this 1/4 inch. I don't really need to back stitch quite yet. I'm going to get all situated here. Usually my binding is on a spool back there, but I needed to trim this down, so I have this little piece. All right, so do not tug on your binding. It is very stretchy right now, and this is kind of one of the only times you don't tug your binding when you're doing this kind of seam finish, because you really need this edge right here, this outer edge, to be as long as possible when we're done. And so if you were to take a ruler and measure on the seam line right here around the perimeter of the neckline, and then compare it to where this edge is going to sew, you would know that where this edge is going to sew is longer than where this edge is going to sew. So we really need as much length as possible, so don't stretch it. All right, so we're just going to keep this nice and loose. Don't stretch out your neckline because there's a lot of bias, especially on this one. If you need to pin it, go for it. There's a little seam in my binding. I'm going to press that over. It's kind of a funky seam there. I'm just using the width of my presser foot, the 1/2 of it, as a guide. I find that to be the easiest way to kind of maintain 1/4 inch seam allowance. And 1/4 inch seam allowance is some of my favorite seam allowance for things like accessories, bags. And on garments, I like it for necklines, collars, cuffs, plackets, things like that. So I'm even kind of pushing the fabric of the garment I'm kind of pushing it a little bit. I'm not getting tucks in there. I'm not even trying. I'm just trying to keep it as slack as possible. But really, it's the binding we want as slack as possible, not the shirt. All right, so we're just gonna lay this right down on top there. Now I'll backstitch. And then I'm just gonna trim it flush pretty much with that turned back edge right there. All right, so now we're gonna clip into our neckline all the way around, especially in the curvy bits. So we're gonna clip all the way up to the seam allowance. Don't go through. But make sure that you clip all the way. And you can see it's already kind of pulling up, right? See, it's already pulling up. So a note about clipping. Now, if you're gonna clip every ½ inch, it's gonna be kind of a blocky curve, right? So the more clips, especially in those curvier areas you get, the more curve you're gonna get. So think about those clips, each of those clips making the circle itself. And then it might make a little bit more sense. I don't know if that makes sense, but you really want a nice smooth curve. So make sure these clips are all the way to that seam allowance. Because remember, we just put a very straight piece of fabric to a curve. Even though it has a stretch because it's cut on the bias, you still need that give. You need it to release because this seam allowance, this is another way to look at it, which pretty much drives it home for most people. This seam allowance right here is going to press back onto itself, not onto itself, but into the garment, right? Because we're going to have this edge. So if this edge right here has to fold back into the garment, this edge right here measures shorter than where it's lying, just like the binding is going to do. So it needs to be able to spread out. All those little cuts need to be able to spread out so that it can relax. And you'll get a smoother curve. All right. Okay, we're back at the beginning. So make sure you go through all those thicknesses too, especially if you're doing a neckline that has any seams or thicknesses. Make sure that you clip into there to kind of make it, you know, as soft and pliant as possible. All right, so our next step is we're going to, you can iron it right now or you can skip the ironing. I think ironing is going to be really helpful though. Just remember, don't stretch anything out while you're ironing. You just really want to push the seam allowance towards the binding. And then we're going to edge stitch the binding, and then we're going to turn it to the inside, and then we're going to hopefully have a nice flat bias finish. Okay, we're back from the iron, and I just pressed my seam allowance toward the bias. So one of the theories I have is that maybe skipping the understitch step would let it lay flatter because you're not binding it up. But the risk you run there is that you're not going to ensure that your binding stays to the inside of the garment because you don't want it to show, right? You don't want any of this to creep out. Although you can see, if you watch my tunic number 1 video, mine does. It kind of does this little edge then. So, all right, so now look at that. We have it nice into the inside there. You can see it already wants to creep out. So now we're going to understitch it. And understitching means that you're pressing the seam allowance towards the object you're stitching on. So all of this seam allowance is towards the binding, and I'm stitching on the binding. So we're still not stitching on the garment. None of our stitching is showing. And if you ironed first, this makes this step pretty easy. Remember, don't stretch anything out. Okay, so now we're going to press it again, and we're going to press it from this side, and we're going to pull the binding over. And now if you like as well, you can turn under this edge and press that as well. Now you can just turn this under a little bit, maybe make the seam allowances match like that. It does, you know, this depends on what width you want. So the thing to think about is the stitching that's going to show on the other side with your bobbin. So if you really want a narrow one, you probably want to trim down your binding a little bit. You can even, you know, this part is a little bit thick because of the layers. But if you look at over here, you could even wrap it around the seam allowance there and get it nice and small. So fold this all the way to the seam line and then fold it over as well. So it just depends on what look you're going for. I'm gonna iron this so that my raw edge meets the seam line that we were just sewing. Okay, so we have our binding pressed to the inside here, and I'm just going to fold it as I sew, but if you wanted to, you could have ironed your next step as well, pre-ironed it. I don't find it makes much of a difference for me, but it may help you. And if you want to pin it, go for it as well. And I would definitely pin perpendicular to your neckline like this, so that you can just sew right over your pins as you go. I know a lot of people don't like to do that, but I do that. So, all right, so you can already see, like, this doesn't want to lay flat, and you can see why this is such a challenge, right? And that's why doing it as narrow as possible gives it a fighting chance that it's going to lay flat, as opposed to if I had maybe serged this edge and then just stitched it down. That does seem like the easy way to go, but and you could do that actually. You don't even need to serge it if it's binding, because binding doesn't unravel. So you could just lay it flat and top stitch it down. So when you went to iron this, just make sure you can see a little sliver of color from the shirt on the outside, so that way you know for certain none of your binding is going to show on the outside of the garment. That's how I do it. You can see a little bit more right there. It's really hard here, so I just get a little tiny sliver. So if you really want the easy way out and you don't want to be frustrated, why not just lay it down and top stitch it and you're done? Or maybe overlock it if you want and then do that, but it really won't unravel, I promise. You can look at my video on Do You Need a Serger to see that. And then I'm going to clean finish this so you can see the struggle. All right, so here we go. I'm folding mine all the way to the neckline edge to get it as narrow as possible. And I'm doing this in contrast threads so you can see my stitches. In fact, maybe I'll bring my camera down so you can see the sewing as well. So now this is where you're going to start getting a lot of the difficulty, and you want this to be as nice and flat as possible. And having the binding as narrow as possible really helps this. So if this was wider and the binding was the same length on either long edge, you're going to struggle because it's not a facing. It's a straight strip going to a curve. I like the mark of lining up that raw edge to the neckline seam because it's kind of a very easy way to keep it nice and even in width. I'm going nice and slow so you can see exactly what's happening. I can still see a sliver of green right here, but it's very skint, so I got to make sure none of my binding sneaks to the outside. Another thing I should note, and that I'm thinking of right now off the top of my head, is if you decided to do a shirt like this with the binding finish, if you pre-wash this fabric and you didn't pre-wash your binding, you're going to have some issues once it's been sewn and laundered. So I highly recommend washing your binding and pre-washing it for shrinkage, because it will look a lot better after it's been made and washed, because the binding is shrinking this way on the bias, whereas the garment's shrinking this way. So you got to make sure that you just get rid of all that shrinkage. And then you won't get the bumps that are so common with a binding finish. All right. So yeah, did I go right along that edge? No, but I didn't maintain a nice parallel edge. And let's see what it looks like on the other side. All right, not too bad. That's an iron fold right there. That's not a tuck. A little bit of the torquing there. That'll probably always be there. I can iron that out right now and it'll be gone, but it'll come back. I hope this helps, and happy sewing. Bye.